So now we're going to start talking about communications with the public. Generally referred to as retail communications for most questions, but there are other types of communications that we do need to be aware of. But retail communication is defined as any material used in the media, newspaper, magazines, radio, television. There can be no guarantees, no promises. There's almost always going to require some principle to at least review it, except in the case of what are referred to as institutional communications. Those are communications distributed and made available only to institutional investors. There's no principle needed. Institutional investors are basically companies, banks, financial companies that have at least $50 million invested. Sales literature. This is defined as anything that's written or electronic communications that is made generally available to the public. Again, if it's limited to only certain restricted people, it may no longer be considered sales literature. Reprints, telemarketing scripts, performance reports, and circulars are all types of sales literature. I like making sure that we understand when they're talking, especially on a FINRA exam or any securities exam, about telemarketing scripts. They're talking about the cold call telemarketing scripts to sell securities. They're not talking about life insurance. They're not talking about possible recruitment or job opportunities. They're not talking about referrals. None of those. They're talking about someone calling and going, "Hi, Mr. or Mrs. Client. This is Brian from such and such brokerage. I have your account here. We have this new security we think would be perfect for you. It's got this feature, this feature, this feature. We'd love to set up a time when we can talk to you in more detail. Wednesday, Thursday, good for you." Whatever the script is. But that kind of script, not one of the scripts that we're going to deal with. I've never had a telemarketing script that was going to fall under sales literature. I've written a lot. I've been given a lot. Never had any of them crossed into what would be considered securities sales literature. Retail communication is defined as anything that is distributed to more than 25 retail investors within any 30 calendar day period. That is retail communications. Correspondence is anything less. Nobody wants to read a boring financial statement. Can you add some sex and violence? Just to make sure that we understand, communication is more than 25. That's 26 or more in a 30-day period. Correspondence is 25 or less. That's less than 26, again, in any 30-day period. Communications must always be checked by a principal before the client sees it. Correspondence just needs to be spot checked. Correspondence can be things like birthday cards. It can be things that don't deal with securities. If I'm sending a letter to 1,000 clients inviting them to our annual holiday party, our annual summer party, we're gonna have picnic foods. We're gonna have a bunch of different food trucks. We're gonna have a bouncy castle for the kids. We're gonna have live music. We're gonna have a magic show, whatever. But it's nothing about securities. It's just a party that we're inviting our clients to. It's not the same as securities in that case. Advertising and sales literature approval, record keeping, and filing requirements. Well, advertisement, sales literature, and any other retail communication must be kept on file for 3 years starting from the date of first use and last use. Basically, that means 3 years from the last time you used it when you really get down to it. But it is technically from first and last use. Advertisements and sales literature must be filed with FINRA within 10 days after use. Notice that is filed with, not approved by. That's also with FINRA, not SEC, and 10 days after use, not before. Now, you must understand as well that this is for established firms. If there is a question that specifically mentions newly established firms, firms less than a year in the business, a year or less, newly established firms, they have a 10-day pre-file requirement. They must file at least 10 days before first use. Telemarketing. These are calling people we don't know to try and get them to buy something. These rules are basically dealing with cold calling. No private residence can be called before 8 a.m. their local time or after 9 p.m. their local time zone. Make sure if you're calling other states that you are checking what time it is where they are. You want to check the do not call list. It may be shortened to the DNC, the do not call list. That's a national list, and there's one at the company a list where it's people who you're not allowed to call. They don't want to be called. You can't call them outside of certain circumstances. We're going to be talking about that shortly. The do not call list. If they're not expecting you to call, you must check the do not call list. Now understand, I don't make cold calls anymore. I don't need to worry about the do not call list. I call people who have been referred to me. I call people who've called me and I'm returning their call. I call people who, actually primarily it's referrals or who call me because they were referred to me. But there's probably a couple of other places. I know in the past I've sent out mailers, things like that. If people ask to be called, you don't have to worry about it. If the client requests to never be called again, you must add them to the company do not call list. I think it's 30 days. It's not really important to know how long you have. Maybe. I think it's 30. It might be 15. But I think it's 30 days. Another one I liked. I don't know how you got my number up here, but I do not need any afterlife insurance. Continuing with telemarketing, those exceptions to the do not call list include if there's an established business relationship, even if the person is on the do not call list, but the telemarketer has made a financial transaction within 18 months of the call. If the telemarketer happens to be the broker or dealer of record on that client's account, we can call our clients even if they're on the do not call list. If the person contacted us within the last 3 months of the call, when I sent out those mailers, there was a little postcard that they'd return. If they returned it, I had 3 months to get in touch with them. Didn't need to check the do not call list for those hot leads. Continuing as well, personal relationships you don't need to worry about. If your parents are on the do not call list, you can still call them. Family and friends, acquaintances. Those are like the referrals and warm leads that you sometimes get. This all comes from the Telephone Consumer Protection Act of 1991. When making cold calls, reps must record the names and put on the do not call list if uninterested. Yep, it is within the 30 days. And must tell prospect the firm's name. Now we have some suitability requirements that we're going to discuss here. Not a huge amount here, but again, we're dealing with communicating with the clients. We need to make sure we know who our clients are. The bank and anti-money laundering regulations, the requiring proof of identity, making sure the client is who they say they are. We need to explain that that's who it is. We need to explain who we are. We can't cover anything up or hide who we represent. But those topics we definitely discuss in other areas in much more detail. Cartoon here, woof, woof, woof. Why did you steal my identity? I don't even have a credit card. When we're dealing with recommendations, because we've got to sort of see the difference between what sort of communications, which is, I guess, lesser than an actual recommendation. That we can't sort of recommend unless we know the client more. General requirements are going to be that we must have a reasonable basis for believing that the recommendation is suitable for the client. In making this assessment, the broker must consider our income, net worth, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and other securities holdings. Anything that is including those things is going to be considered a recommendation. It can be based on age, other investments, their situation, needs, tax status, objectives, experience, time horizon, liquidity needs, risk tolerance, or any other information disclosed. Sometimes you might have clients that specifically say they don't want to invest in certain industries, or they don't want to invest in certain companies, even through mutual funds. But if you're getting into that level of questioning, that no longer is going to be considered retail communication. That's going to be a recommendation. That brings us to the end of this unit. We're going to be starting to talk about associated persons next, what we're trying to be by taking these exams. Communications are definitely a topic that you are likely to see at least a couple of questions on, depending on which exam. Both the SIE and the Series 6 are going to have some questions on recommendations and especially communications. But we are going to talk about recommendations in a bit more detail in a later section. That brings us to the end. I hope you enjoyed this. Have a great day.